December 7th, 1941, 7:53 a.m. For 1,000 feet above Oahu, Hawaii, the air inside the cockpit of the Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber is thin and smells of burnt castor oil and adrenaline. Below you, the island of Oahu is a lush emerald set in a sea of calm, indifferent blue. It looks peaceful. It looks like I'm asleep. But inside the formation of 183 Japanese aircraft, the radio silence is deafening. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda slides back his canopy, the wind howling against his flight helmet. He looks down at the harbor. The pearls are there, the great gray beasts of the American Pacific Fleet, moored in pairs along Battleship Row. They are sitting ducks. Fukuda fires a single flare. Tora! 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 Within seconds, the sky tears open. The scream of dive bombers drowns out the Sunday morning church bells. Explosions bloom like terrifying flowers across the decks of the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma. The water turns black with oil and red with blood. To the Japanese pilots, this is perfection. It is the culmination of months of rigorous training in Kagoshima Bay. They are decapitating the American giant in a single stroke. But amidst the smoke and the fire, amidst the cheering pilots and the dying sailors, a fatal error is happening in plain sight. Look closely at the edge of the harbor, just past the burning battleships. Sitting quietly on the gentle slopes near the submarine base are rows of massive, cylindrical structures. They aren't hidden. They aren't camouflaged. They are the upper tank farms. Inside those tanks sits 4.5 million barrels of heavy fuel oil. As the Japanese zero strafe the decks and the Kates drop their torpedoes, they fly right over these tanks. They ignore them completely. The mission parameters are strict. Sink the battleships, destroy the carriers, cripple the airfields. The oil is considered a secondary, irrelevant target. This is the first, and perhaps the greatest, miscalculation of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would later take command of the shattered fleet, would look back on this morning with a shudder. He knew the math that the Japanese had ignored. If Fukuda's pilots had tipped their wings and dropped just a fraction of their ordnance on those tanks, the resulting inferno would have been apocalyptic. For 0.5 million barrels of oil would have turned Pearl Harbor into a boiling cauldron of fire, unreachable for months. But more importantly, without that oil, the surviving American ships, the aircraft carriers that were luckily out at sea, would have been useless floating steel. The United States Navy ran on bunker sea fuel oil. Without it, propellers don't turn. Without it, the arsenal of democracy is just a scrapyard. If those tanks had been destroyed, the U.S. fleet would have been forced to retreat 2,500 miles back to the California coast. The Pacific would have been ceded to Japan for years, not months. Instead, the Japanese pilots fly home, drunk on a tactical victory, leaving the strategic lifeblood of their enemy completely touched. Back in Tokyo, the celebrations begin. The radio broadcasts herald a new era of dominance. But in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of the Imperial Naval General Staff, the logistical officers are already sweating. They know something the public does not. They know that this war was started not because of territory or ideology or honor. It started because of an hourglass. Japan is a modern industrial giant with a fatal heart condition. It produces almost no oil of its own. For years, 80% of its oil came from the United States. But when President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo in July 1941, the hourglass was flipped. The Imperial Navy burns 2,900 tons of oil every single day just to conduct peacetime exercises. In war, that number will triple. The calculations on the desks in Tokyo are terrifyingly simple. Japan has a stockpile of 43 million barrels. That is enough for perhaps 18 months of all-out war. After that, the ships stop, The planes fall. The lights go out. The attack on Pearl Harbor bought them time, but it didn't buy them fuel. The clock is ticking louder than ever. To survive, the Empire must do more than sink battleships. They must seize the southern resource area, the Dutch East Indies. They need the oil wells of Sumatra and Borneo, and they need them intact. But as the smoke clears over Hawaii, the Japanese High Command is making assumptions that will kill them. They are assuming the war will be short. They are assuming the Americans will lose the will to fight. And most fatally, they are assuming that the math of logistics will bend to the spirit of the samurai. They are wrong. The arithmetic of empire is unforgiving, and the first variable has already been entered incorrectly. February 14th, 1942, 11:30 a.m. The skies over Palembang, Sumatra. The humidity hits you before the ground does. 300 feet above the jungle canopy, hundreds of white silk parachutes snap open. These aren't ordinary infantry. They are the Tishin Shudan, the Imperial Army's elite paratroopers. They aren't dropping to capture a city, a fortress, or a general. They are dropping to capture a timeline. Their target is the Plaju and Sungay-grown refineries. These two massive industrial complexes, sprawling along the Musi River, are the beating heart of the Dutch East Indies oil production. They represent 50% of Japan's desperate fuel requirements. For the men floating down into the heavy tropical air, the mission is paradoxical. Capture the enemy facilities, but do not let the enemy fight back. If a stray bullet hits a storage tank, the prize goes up in smoke. If the Dutch have time to flip a switch, the pump seize. Japan needs this infrastructure intact. The Empire's stockpile is already down by millions of barrels since Pearl Harbor. Every day the refineries are offline is a day the Imperial Navy moves closer to paralysis. On the ground, the Dutch defenders know exactly why the Japanese are here. They have been expecting this since the first bomb fell on Hawaii. As the Japanese paratroopers cut their chutes and rush the perimeter fences, they hear it, a deep rhythmic thudding. Not artillery, not gunfire. It is a sound of detonation charges deep underground. The Dutch engineers are executing a plan of their own. It is cold, calculated industrial suicide. They aren't just retreating, they are salting the earth. They pour cement down the boreholes. They smash the delicate cracking towers. They open the valves on the storage tanks, letting rivers of crude oil flood the muddy compounds, and then they light the match. By the time the Japanese secure the perimeter, the sky is choked with black smoke. The southern resource area, the promised land of limitless energy, is a burning ruin. In Tokyo, the reports are initially grim, but the Japanese are industrious. They have prepared for this. Along with the soldiers, they sent a shadow army of engineers, geologists, and drilling experts. They descend on Sumatra like surgeons in a field hospital. They work around the clock, drilling out the concrete, patching the pipes, and bullying the scar machinery back to life. Miraculously, within months, the oil is flowing. By 1943, production in the captured territories actually exceeds pre-war levels. On paper, it looks like a triumph. The rising sun flies over the richest oil fields in Asia. The gamble seems to have paid off. But this is where the arithmetic of empire delivers its second brutal variable. It is one thing to pull oil out of the ground in Sumatra. It is an entirely different thing to get it 3,000 miles north to the factories in Osaka and the naval bases in Kure. Look at a map of the Pacific. It is vast. The shipping lanes from Singapore and the Dutch East Indies to Japan form a long, tenuous artery known as a Crude Rubber Line. To keep the war machine running, Japan needs to transport millions of tons of liquid cargo through this artery every single month. And here lies the fatal oversight. The Japanese Planning Board, blinded by the assumption of a short war, failed to build a tanker fleet capable of sustaining a long one. They have battleships that can hurl shells 20 miles. They have Zeros that can outmaneuver anything in the sky. But they do not have enough boring, slow rust bucket tankers. They calculated they would need 6 million tons of shipping capacity. They started the war with barely that amount. They assumed they could requisition civilian ships to fill the gap. They assumed their losses would be minimal because the American Navy was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. They were wrong. The consumption rates are skyrocketing. The massive Yamato-class battleships are thirsty beasts, burning through fuel at a rate that makes logistics officers weep. Just to move the fleet from Truck Lagoon to a battle station burns enough oil to heat a Japanese city for a year. The planners predicted the Navy would consume 25% less fuel than it actually does. They are burning the candle at both ends, fighting a high-intensity war across a perimeter that is too large to defend, using ships that are too thirsty to sustain. And now, a new sound is beginning to echo in the shipping lanes. A sound more terrifying than the air raid sirens. It is the ping of active sonar. The American submarine force, initially plagued by faulty torpedoes and timid tactics, is fixing its problems. They are beginning to understand the math. 2. They realize they don't need to sink the Yamato to win the war. They just need to sink the tanker, bringing the Yamato its lunch. The Artery is exposed. The Japanese tanker fleet is unarmed, unescorted, and unaware that the water beneath them is filling with wolves. September 21st, 1943, 3 a.m., deep beneath the Luzon Strait. The world is condensed into the smell of diesel fumes, sweat, and recycled air. You are inside the pressure hull of the USS Wahoo, arguably the deadliest predator in the Pacific. Commander Mush Morton is at the periscope. The silence is absolute, save for the hum of the electric motors and the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the overhead pipes. Through the glass eye of the periscope, the target is a silhouette against the moonlight. It isn't a battleship. It isn't a carrier. It is a clumsy, rusting hulk sitting low in the water. The Conra Maru, a tanker. To a samurai, this target is unworthy of a warrior's attention. To the Americans, this target is more valuable than gold. Fire 1. Fire 2. The submarine shudders as the Mark 14 torpedoes leave the tubes. The crew counts the seconds. It is simple math. Distance divided by speed equals death. Boom. A geyser of water and fire erupts against the night sky. But the most damaging part isn't the explosion. It's what happens next. As the Conra Maru cracks in half and slides beneath the waves, it takes 10,000 tons of crude oil with it. That is fuel that will never refine into aviation gas. That is fuel that will never power Zero. That is fuel that will never spin the propellers of a destroyer guarding the homeland. By late 1943, this scene was repeating itself with terrifying frequency across the Pacific. The Crude Rubber Line has become a slaughterhouse. The Americans have fixed their faulty torpedoes. They have cracked the Japanese naval codes. They know exactly where the tankers are, when they are leaving, and where they are going. They have turned the Pacific Ocean into a shooting gallery. But the true tragedy for Japan isn't just the American aggression. It is their own arrogance. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, there's a hierarchy of prestige. Battleships are the kings. Cruisers are the knights. Protecting a slow, dirty merchant ship is considered scavenger work. It is beneath the dignity of a destroyer captain. So, while the British and Americans organize massive, heavily guarded convoys in the Atlantic to fight off German U-boats, the Japanese send their tankers out alone, unescorted, defenseless. It is a strategic suicide pact. Back in Tokyo, the charts on the wall are beginning to look like an autopsy report. The Arithmetic of Empire has reached its tipping point. The planners estimated they would lose 800,000 tons of shipping in the first year of war. In reality, the American submarines sink 1.5 million tons. By 1944, That number will explode to nearly 4 million tons. Shipyards in Japan are working furiously, riveting steel plates together day and night. But they cannot build ships faster than the Americans can sink them. The math is relentless. The graph lines have crossed. The tonnage of the merchant marine is in free fall. The consequences ripple through every level of the war effort, invisible but lethal. Because the tankers aren't arriving, the refineries in Japan are running at 50% capacity. Because the refineries are slowing down, the reserve stocks are being drained to critically low levels. And because the fuel is scarce, the training schools stop flying. Young Japanese pilots, the replacements for the veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal, are being sent into combat with barely 30 hours of flight time. Why? Because there is no aviation gas to spare for practice loops. They are learning to fly in classrooms on chalkboards instead of in cockpits. When they finally meet the American Hellcats in the sky, they are slaughtered not because they lack courage, but because they lack kerosene. The great alligator of the Imperial Navy is beginning to starve. The desperation reaches such a fever pitch that the High Command makes a decision that dooms their operational flexibility forever. They split the fleet. They send the battleships south to Singapore, near the oil fields, just so they can refuel directly from the source. They keep the aircraft carriers in Japan, waiting for new planes and pilots. The fleet is now divided by 3,000 miles of ocean. A navy that cannot sail together cannot fight together. The fuel shortage has done what the U.S. Navy cannot. It has broken the cohesion of the combined fleet. And amidst this logistical collapse, the Americans are preparing their death blow. They are coming for the islands. They are coming for the Marianas. And the Japanese Navy must sail out to meet them, checking their fuel gauges with every nautical mile, knowing that even if they survive the battle, they might not have enough oil to get home. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. It is the largest carrier battle in history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. To the American pilots, it feels like a carnival game. They are shooting down hundreds of Japanese planes with ease. The sky is raining burning aluminum. But beneath the spectacle of aerial combat, the Japanese fleet is moving like a boxer in the final round. Sluggish, predictable, and exhausted. Admiral Jisaburo Zawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, is a brilliant tactician. But he is fighting with one hand tied behind his back. His movements are dictated not by strategy, but by the fuel gauge. He cannot maneuver aggressively. He cannot flank at full speed. He has to sail in straight lines to conserve oil. He is forced to use unrefined Borneo crude in his boilers, a desperate substitute that is volatile and dirty. The highly flammable fumes seep through the ventilation shafts of his aircraft carriers. The volatile crude eats away at the engine seals. When the American torpedoes finally hit the carrier tile, the pride of the Japanese fleet, she doesn't sink immediately, but the unrefined crude vapors fill the hangar decks, turning the ship into a floating bomb. One spark, just one accidental spark from a generator switch, and the armored flight deck is blown completely off the hull. The Taiho sinks, taking the hopes of the Empire with her. It is a defeat born of chemistry as much as combat. After the disaster at the Philippine Sea, the situation shifted from critical to terminal. The arithmetic of the Empire has returned a result of 0. The home islands are now effectively cut off. The tankers have stopped arriving. The oil that was captured in the Dutch East Indies is stuck there, rotting in storage tanks that the Japanese cannot empty. The blockade is complete. In Tokyo, the lights are literally going out. Power plants burn coal, because there is no oil. Civilians are digging up pine roots to distill a crude, resinous fuel for the few remaining trucks. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, is now a collection of steel islands anchored in Kure Harbor. The mighty battleship Yamato sits motionless, a prisoner of its own thirst. But the war isn't over. The Americans are landing at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The High Command decides on one final, suicidal gamble, a shogo or victory operation. They will throw everything they have left at the American landing fleet. But there's a problem. They don't have enough fuel to get the entire fleet to the battle and back. They scrape the bottom of every tank in the Empire. They drain the reserves from the cruisers to fill the battleships. It is a cannibalistic logistics operation. When the fleet sorties for the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, they are sailing on fumes. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, knows that if he accelerates to flank speed for combat, he will be drifting dead in the water before the battle ends. The stress of the fuel gauge breaks the psychological back of the commanders. At the climax of the battle off Sumatra, Kurita has a vulnerable American transport ships in his sights. He can destroy the landing force. He can achieve the objective. But he hesitates. He looks at his fuel reports. He calculates the distance home. He convinces himself that he is facing a larger force than he actually is. He turns around. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, turns its massive guns away from the enemy and steams north, retreating not from American fire, but from the terrifying prospect of running dry in hostile waters. The gamble fails. The fleet is shattered. The remaining ships limp back to port, never to sail as a unified force again. Back in Japan, the final act of the tragedy begins. The pilots of the Kamikaze Corps are being briefed. Their planes are loaded with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. There is no need to calculate the return journey anymore. The math has become horrifyingly simple. One plane, one pilot, one ship. It is the ultimate efficiency of a bankrupt empire. They are substituting blood for oil. April 6, 1945. Tokuyama Bay, Japan. The water is calm, but the mood is funereal. The battleship Yamato looms against the gray sky, a floating mountain of steel. She is the greatest warship ever built, the pride of the empire. But today, she is a beggar. Alongside her hull, smaller destroyers are docked, hoses snake across the decks. They are not taking fuel from a tanker. They are siphoning fuel out of their own tanks to give to the battleship. Local depots are being drained. There are rumors, some true, some exaggerated, that soy oil is being mixed into the bunkers. The logistics officers have scraped the bottom of the Empire's barrel to find just enough heavy oil for this final sortie. Operation Tengo. The orders are chilling in their simplicity. Sail to Okinawa. Beach the ship. Turn the hull into an unsinkable fortress. Fire the 18-inch guns until the shells run out. Die fighting. The officers on the bridge look at the fuel gauges. There's 4,000 tons of oil in the bunkers. It is just enough to get to Okinawa. There is no fuel allocated for a return trip. The math has finally become binary. Go and do not come back. The Yamato sails into history not as a conqueror, but as a sacrifice. On April 7th, the American carrier planes found her. Without fuel for air cover, the Yamato is naked. She is swarmed by nearly 400 aircraft. She maneuvers sluggishly, her boilers struggling, her evasive turns slow and labored. She takes 10 torpedoes, then 12. At 2:23 p.m., the forward magazines detonated. The explosion is so massive it is seen 100 miles away in Kagoshima. A mushroom cloud, a grim preview of what is to come, rises over the ocean. The symbol of the Imperial Navy is gone. The fuel is gone. The war is over, even if the fighting continues. Back on the mainland, the silence is the loudest sound of all. In the factories of Mitsubishi and Nakajima, the assembly lines are still. There is aluminum, there is steel, there are workers, but there is no power. The lights are dead. The machinery is cold. They are grounded by physics. A plane without gas is just a sculpture. The pilots sit on the runways and weep as they watch their cities burn, unable to start their engines. The fatal miscalculation has come full circle. The decision to ignore the oil tanks at Pearl Harbor, the failure to protect the tanker fleet, the delusion that spirit could overcome logistics. It has all led to this paralyzed moment. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The sky is gray, mirroring the steel of the Allied fleet. It is an armada that stretches to the horizon. Hundreds of ships. Carriers, battleships, destroyers, tankers. Dozens of them. Fat, heavy, and riding low in the water. They are floating lakes of oil. The Americans have brought their own supply chain across the entire Pacific Ocean. On the deck of the USS Missouri, the Japanese delegation arrives. They are dressed in formal tailcoats and top hats, looking small and fragile against the massive 16-inch guns of the American ship. As Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signs the instrument of surrender, the drone of aircraft engines begins to be built. It starts as a hum and becomes a roar. 450 carrier planes from the U.S. Third Fleet fly over the ceremony in a massive formation. Then came the B-29s. It is a display of overwhelming industrial power. It is a display of fuel. To the Japanese officers watching, the lesson is bitter and absolute. They didn't just lose a war of tactics. They lost a war of numbers. They realized too late that amateurs talk about strategy, but professionals talk about logistics. The Empire of the Sun set not because of a lack of bravery, but because of a lack of barrels. The arithmetic was always there, written in the oil stains on the water at Pearl Harbor, waiting to be solved. And the answer was 0.